I've been trying to figure out how to tell this for about 3 years. Every time I start, I get maybe 2 pages in and then I stop. Not because it's painful to write about, but because I can't find the right place to begin. There are too many possible entry points. I could start with the job listing. I could start with my marriage ending, or whatever you'd call what happened between Carol and me, since it never actually ended the way divorces end. I could start with the night I found the second name in the log, but none of those feel right on their own, because none of them explain the others. So I'll start with where I was when I took the job, because that's the only thing that makes the rest of it make sense. I was 41 years old, and I was renting a single room in a house on Garfield Street in Missoula, Montana, from a retired school teacher named Donna, who left passive-aggressive notes on the refrigerator about whose yogurt was whose. The room had a window that faced the alley and a radiator that banged all night in November like something wanted out. I had been living there for 4 months. Before that, I had been sleeping on an air mattress in a friend's spare bedroom in Billings while I figured out what I was going to do next, and before that, I had been in a house in Bozeman with Carol and our 2 cats and a mortgage that was almost manageable and a job I had held for 11 years. The job was the first thing to go, or maybe the second. It's hard to say. Intermountain Civil Services laid off 19 people in August of that year, and I was one of them. I had been a project engineer there for the last 6 years, mostly doing infrastructure work, culverts, drainage systems, road survey corrections, that kind of thing. Not glamorous, not the sort of work people have opinions about, but it was steady and I was good at it and I knew the territory, which in Montana means something, because the land has its own logic, and if you don't learn it, you'll make expensive mistakes. Getting laid off at 41 is a different experience than getting laid off at, say, 28. At 28, you're inconvenienced. At 41, you're looking at your resume and realizing that everything on it is now a story about a version of you that doesn't exist anymore. The projects I had managed were finished. The company was restructuring. The people who had been my references were also laid off or had moved to different states. I sent out applications for 3 months and got 2 interviews and no offers, and my savings, which I had always thought of as a safety net, turned out to be more of a thin blanket. It covered the basics but left a lot exposed. Carol and I had been having problems before the layoff, the kind that you can paper over with routine and distraction, but that don't actually go away. The layoff removed the routine. I won't say it ruined the marriage because I don't think that's fair to either of us. But by February, I had moved out of the house, at her request and also at mine, and by March I was in Billings on the air mattress, and by July I was in Missoula, with Donna's refrigerator notes and the banging radiator. I was not in a great place. I should be honest about that. I was not exactly depressed in the clinical sense. I was sleeping fine, I wasn't having dark thoughts, I was eating meals and occasionally going for runs along the Clark Fork and doing the things that people do. But I had this persistent sense of having stepped off a path I didn't even know I had been on, and the ground where I landed didn't feel solid. I was spending a lot of time thinking about what I had assumed my life was going to be and measuring that against what it actually was, which is a useless exercise I'd recommend to no one. The job listing came through an email forwarded to me by a guy named Phil Henriksen, who I had worked with briefly at a surveying company in Helena back when I was 26. Phil had stayed in the environmental monitoring business while I moved into civil engineering, and we still kept loose touch the way you do with people from your early career. Birthday acknowledgments on LinkedIn, occasional forwarded things that one of you thought the other might find interesting. He sent me the listing with a message that said something like, "Probably not what you're looking for, but it's work, and it's your kind of terrain." He was right on both counts. The position was listed under Cascade Atmospheric Services, which I had never heard of. It turned out to be a private firm based in Spokane, Washington, that held service contracts with several federal agencies, primarily NOAA and to a lesser degree, the Forest Service, for maintaining remote automated weather stations throughout the Pacific Northwest and Northern Rockies. The job was officially titled Remote Instrumentation Technician, which is a deliberately vague title that could mean almost anything. What it meant here was, drive to a weather station in the mountains of central Montana once a week, perform calibration checks and visual inspection of the instruments, replace anything that needed replacing, troubleshoot anything that wasn't performing right, and log everything. Pay was $22 an hour, plus mileage at the federal rate, which is actually not bad money for work that involves being alone in the wilderness with a toolkit. The station was designated AWS-14 in Cascade's internal numbering system, though NOAA had their own designation for it that I won't use because it might make the station too easy to find. For our purposes, it was AWS-14. It sat at roughly 6,800 feet elevation in the mountains, about 43 miles east of the town of Drummond, Montana, which is the kind of town you drive through without stopping unless you need gas. The station had been operating for about 14 years at the point I took the job, and had gone through, according to the contract documentation, 3 previous technicians. The access road was unpaved for the last 11 miles and impassable in deep winter, which meant the winter maintenance schedule was compressed. You had to get everything done before the road closed, and then hope the automated systems held through until spring. I applied on a Tuesday and got a call back the following Monday from a woman named Ruth Daly, who handled contracts and personnel for Cascade's Montana operations. She was businesslike in an almost comforting way, asked about my background, asked if I had experience with data logging equipment, asked about my physical fitness because the work involved carrying equipment up steep terrain in unpredictable weather. I told her about the 11 years at Intermountain and mentioned the fieldwork I'd done, which was substantial. She said they'd be in touch. The offer came 4 days later. I took about 20 minutes to think it over, which is a much shorter time than I would have taken 4 months earlier, when I still had a savings cushion worth respecting. I signed the contract electronically that afternoon. The training was 2 days. A senior technician named Tom Geary drove down from Spokane and met me at a coffee shop in Missoula on a Thursday morning in early October. Tom was in his late 50s, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered face that comes from years of working outside at elevation. He was the sort of person who doesn't waste words, which I found immediately comfortable. We spent the first day going through Cascade's maintenance protocols and documentation requirements, most of which were straightforward if you'd worked with field instruments before. They used Campbell Scientific CR1000X data loggers at most of their stations, which I had encountered before in a tangential way, and the basic maintenance tasks, cleaning the paranometer domes, checking the barometric transducer for drift, verifying the anemometer cup rotations, servicing the tipping bucket precipitation gauge, were all things that followed a clear logic once you understood what you were measuring and why. The second day, Tom drove me out to AWS 14. It takes about an hour and 15 minutes from Drummond on a good day. You take US 90 east for a short stretch, then you cut north on a county road that has no formal name, just a route number, and follow it until you reach the locked gate at the base of the Forest Service access road. Tom had the gate combination. From there, it's another 40 minutes on a rutted single track that climbs through lodgepole pine and then opens up into a series of alpine meadows as you approach the ridge. In October, the grass in the meadows was already tawny, and the larch trees had gone gold along the edges, and the mountains beyond the ridge had a hard look, the snow line sitting maybe 1,000 feet above us. It was a cold, clear day, with wind coming from the northwest. I remember thinking the light looked different up there, cleaner somehow, and that I didn't hate the idea of coming here once a week. The station itself is not dramatic. People seem to have a notion that weather stations look like something out of a science fiction movie, but they're actually fairly modest installations. At AWS 14, you had a 10-foot instrument tower mounted on a concrete pad, which supported the anemometer at the top and the temperature/relative humidity shield partway down, a separate mast for the paranometer array, a heated enclosure at ground level, basically a weatherproof electrical box about the size of a mini fridge that housed the data logger and the radio telemetry equipment, and a bank of 2 solar panels on a south-facing fixed mount with a propane-heated battery backup for winter operation. There was also a tipping bucket rain gauge on its own short post, a snow depth sensor on a pole, and a ground temperature probe buried at a couple of depths. The whole thing sat in a clearing that had been graded flat, surrounded by a short fence of T-posts and smooth wire that kept the elk from rubbing up against the instruments, which they apparently used to do before the fence went in. Tom walked me through the inspection sequence in maybe 2 hours. He showed me where the spare parts kit was stored, a weatherproof bin anchored to the instrument enclosure, and where the service manual was filed, in a plastic binder inside the enclosure next to the data logger. He showed me how to pull the maintenance log from the logger's internal memory onto a USB drive, and how to add my own entries through the logger's keypad interface. He showed me how to access the visual inspection checklist on Cascade's internal web portal and how to submit my reports. Before we left, Tom stood at the fence and looked out over the meadow for a moment. The wind was picking up. He said, "You're going to have days up here when the weather's bad and the road's sketchy, and you'll think about just turning around. Don't, unless the road's actually impassable. The whole point of weekly checks is that problems get caught before they become failures. If you skip a week and something goes wrong, the data gap can invalidate months of the record, and NOAA gets twitchy about that." I told him I understood. The previous tech, he said, good guy, but he started stretching to every 10 days or so in bad weather, and we ended up with gaps we had to flag in the annual data report. Client doesn't like that. I asked who the previous tech was, mostly out of professional curiosity. Tom said his name was Kevin Maurer, that he'd held the position for about 2.5 years and had moved to Colorado for family reasons. Maurer was his last name. I filed it away without thinking much about it. On the drive back, Tom told me about the station's history, in the matter-of-fact way that people in this business accumulate institutional knowledge. AWS 14 had been installed as part of an expanded monitoring network in the Northern Rockies, primarily to feed data into snowpack and avalanche modeling programs that the Forest Service and state agencies rely on for winter planning. The location was chosen because it sat at a critical elevation band and had good radio sightlines to the repeater network. The data it generated was used by, among others, the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Missoula and a couple of university hydrology programs. Nobody famous ever looked at it directly, but it fed into models that fed into forecasts that affected real decisions. Tom dropped me back at my car in Drummond and said the job formally started the following week. He said if I had questions to call or email, and gave me a card. Then he drove away toward Spokane, and I drove back to Missoula and Donna's house and the banging radiator, and that night I reviewed the documentation and the inspection sequence one more time and felt, for the first time in several months, like I had a concrete thing I was responsible for. I want to be careful here about how I describe the first weeks of the job, because I've told parts of this to a few people, and every time I get to the early parts they seem impatient, like they want me to skip ahead. I understand that, but the early weeks matter, not because anything happened in them, nothing happened, but because they established what normal was, and you can't understand what abnormal means without knowing what normal felt like first. Normal felt like this. I would drive out every Tuesday, leaving Missoula around 7 in the morning. The drive takes an hour and 45 minutes total, including the 11 miles on the Forest Service road. I started keeping a small notebook in the cup holder of my truck to jot down road conditions, because the condition of that access road told you a lot about what the week had been like in terms of precipitation and freeze-thaw cycles. In the first few weeks of October, it was mostly dry and rutted, the surface hardened by a summer's worth of UV and traffic, though my truck was usually the only vehicle on it for the last several miles. By late October, I started seeing ice in the shaded sections, and I had a set of chains in the bed just in case. The inspection took between 90 minutes and 2.5 hours, depending on whether everything was running normally or whether something needed closer attention. I had a sequence I followed without variation, because Tom had drilled the importance of sequence into me during training. You start at the enclosure because the data logger is your reference point. If it's not functioning right, everything else you observe is potentially compromised. You check the internal temperature of the enclosure, verify the battery charge, check the communication logs to confirm the telemetry uplinks had gone through, and pull the previous week's data to do a spot check for obvious anomalies. Then you move to the tower. Anemometer cups visually inspected for physical damage, shaft rotated by hand to feel for bearing wear, wind vane alignment verified against a compass bearing, temperature shield fins cleaned of any accumulated debris. Then the precipitation gauges, the snow depth sensor, the soil temperature probes. Then the paranometers, which need their glass domes cleaned with distilled water and a lint-free cloth on a specific schedule. Then a full circuit of the fence perimeter. Then documentation. Every item got logged, the condition of each instrument, the reading at the time of inspection, any maintenance performed, parts replaced, anything observed about the site itself, tracks, damage to the fence, unusual snow accumulation, evidence of vandalism or wildlife interference. The log entries were time-stamped automatically by the data logger when I input them through the keypad. My entries all appeared under a technician identifier that Cascade had programmed into the logger when they set up the contract. T1, meaning Technician 1. That was me. After logging everything, I would take photos with my phone, a visual record that uploaded to Cascade's portal when I got back to range, since there was obviously no cell service up at the station. I'd fill out the online inspection form, flag anything that needed follow-up, and submit. That was the job. Simple, physical, methodical. The kind of work where you can see whether you've done it right. I found I was good at it in the way I'm good at most field work, which is that I'm patient and thorough and not easily bothered by being alone in uncomfortable conditions. In late October, I spent most of one visit dealing with a problem in the tipping bucket mechanism, a small debris blockage in the funnel that was causing the gauge to underreport rainfall. And I worked on it for close to an hour in temperatures around 30 degrees, with a wind blowing out of the northwest at about 25 miles an hour, which is a genuinely cold and unpleasant set of conditions, and I was fine. Not fine in the pretending way, fine in the actual way, where the task in front of you is clear enough that you stop being aware of your own discomfort. I also found, unexpectedly, that I liked the place itself. I'm not a person who usually talks about places in aesthetic terms. I notice them professionally, in terms of drainage and grade and exposure, but I don't typically get attached to landscapes. But there was something about that meadow and that ridge that I kept returning to in my head between visits. The station sat at the highest point of the clearing, and from the instrument tower you could see maybe 12 miles south across a sequence of ridges that stepped down toward the Flint Creek Valley. In clear weather in October, when the sky was that particular deep blue you only get at elevation in the northern Rockies, it looked like something that didn't belong in the ordinary world. I took a photograph of the view one afternoon and set it as my phone wallpaper, which is not something I normally do. I should say something about the social dimension of those weeks, or the absence of it. I ate dinner alone most evenings. I called Carol twice to discuss some administrative things related to our shared finances, and both conversations were civil and conclusive in the specific way that conversations become when there's an understood agreement not to revisit certain things. I talked to Phil Henriksen once on the phone about nothing in particular, the call lasting maybe 15 minutes, and I exchanged messages with my sister in Portland about Thanksgiving plans that ultimately fell through. Donna and I maintained a détente. I was not lonely in a way that felt urgent. I was lonely in the background way that you can almost get used to if you're not careful. October became November, and the weather at the station shifted in the way that high country Montana weather shifts in November, which is decisively. The first serious snowfall came on a Thursday, about 4 inches at the station's elevation, based on the depth sensor readings, and the meadow went white overnight. By my next visit on Tuesday, the snow had settled into a crust, and the temperature at the site during my inspection was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. I wore my expedition weight base layer under my field clothes and my heaviest gloves, and I still had to go back to the truck twice to warm my hands before I could finish the fine manipulation required by the logger keypad. I noted in my report that the propane backup heat for the battery enclosure was functioning within normal parameters, and that the solar panels had a minor buildup of snow that I cleared with a soft brush. The road had been manageable, but I had put the chains on for the last 3 miles. Everything was normal. That was the visit before I first noticed the log entry. The following Tuesday was my 8th visit to the station. I'm sure of this because I kept my own parallel notebook in addition to the electronic records, a habit from my surveying days when the rule was always, if it's not written twice, it might as well not be written. I noted the date, my departure time from Missoula, the road conditions, the time I arrived at the station, and a brief summary of everything I found. 8 visits, 8 entries. The notebook is sitting in a box in my current apartment in Bozeman, and I have looked at it many times in the 3 years since, partly just to confirm that my memory of the sequence of events is actually correct. The day was overcast and cold, around 18 degrees at the site, with a flat white light that made the snow look a little artificial, like a photograph rather than a real landscape. No wind, which was unusual. The road had been fine, dry and frozen solid, so the ruts were manageable. I arrived at 8:47 in the morning and went through my sequence. Everything checked out until I got to the communications log, which was the last thing I reviewed before starting my own entries. The communications log recorded every time data was transmitted from the station to the relay network, every time the logger clock had been synced, and any maintenance entries made since the last inspection. This was how I could confirm my previous entries had saved correctly, and how I could check whether there had been any automated alerts generated during the week. The entry that caught my attention was time-stamped at 2:17 in the morning the previous Thursday. It read, T2 Visual Instrument Enclosure, no anomalies noted. T2, Technician 2. I read it twice, then stood there with the logger keypad in my hands for a moment. My first thought was that it was a legacy entry, that there had been some data in the logger's memory from before my contract that hadn't been properly cleared. The logger held about 2 years of internal memory before it started overwriting old records, and if the previous technician had been designated T2 for some reason, one of his old entries might have persisted. But the timestamp was current, not from 2 years ago, from 4 days ago. I scrolled back through the logs looking for other T2 entries and didn't find any in the previous 8 weeks. Just that one, from 2:17 in the morning on a Thursday in November. I noted it in my own log entry as anomalous T2 identifier entry at timestamp 0217 on prior Thursday. Likely data artifact. Check with Cascade. Then I photographed the logger screen with my phone, finished my inspection, and drove back down the mountain. That evening I sent an email to Tom Geary with the photograph and a brief description of what I'd found. I asked whether T2 was a legacy identifier from a previous contract configuration and whether I needed to do anything to clear it from the system. Tom replied the next morning. His reply was short. He said the T2 designation had been in the logger configuration from a previous contract period when the station had been maintained by 2 technicians in rotation, a setup that had ended about 3 years prior. He said the entry was probably a phantom read. Sometimes old configuration data could appear in the log under specific conditions related to power interruptions or telemetry sync errors. He said it wasn't something to worry about, and that if it happened again, he'd have their tech support team do a full firmware review. I accepted that explanation. It was reasonable. Power interruptions were common at remote stations, especially in winter, when the solar charging was reduced and the propane backup was cycling on and off. A data logger throwing a phantom entry from a corrupted configuration block was not something I would have flagged as impossible. I filed the email, noted in my notebook that Tom had provided the 2 technician explanation, and moved on. The following Tuesday, I drove out in dry, cold weather, did my inspection, and found nothing unusual. Everything was operating normally. My own T1 entries from the previous week were present. The T2 entry from the week before was still there in the log history, which I had expected. The logger didn't erase old entries, but there were no new T2 entries. The week after that, same. Normal visit, normal log, nothing out of place. I started to think about it less. This is, I understand now, the natural thing that happens when an unexplained thing doesn't repeat itself. Your brain files it under explained enough and stops returning to it. Then it came back. The third T2 entry appeared on my 11th visit, and it was different from the first in ways that took me a few minutes to fully process. The timestamp was again in the early morning hours, 3:41 in the morning on a Sunday. The text of the entry read, T2 battery enclosure temp check, temp 38F, propane cycle nominal. This was not a generic entry. This was a specific observation. Battery enclosure temperature 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with the propane heating cycle assessed as nominal. Those are real measurements. Not phantom configuration data. Someone had physically opened the enclosure, read or recorded the internal temperature, verified the propane heating cycle, and entered that information into the data logger at 3:41 in the morning. I checked the enclosure temperature when I read this. It was 41 degrees, which was consistent with the 38 reading from the previous Sunday, given that the ambient temperature had risen slightly over the week. The reading was plausible, not made up, consistent with the conditions. I stood there in the cold for longer than I want to admit just looking at that entry. Two possible explanations came to me. First, Cascade or NOAA had sent a second technician to the station for some reason, maybe a planned maintenance or audit visit, without telling me. This was irritating, but not implausible. The second possibility was that the T2 identifier was being generated by some sensor fault or logger malfunction in a way that was more sophisticated than I'd thought, somehow pulling real values from the station's measurement history and composing plausible-sounding entries. I photographed the screen again and called Tom Geary directly this time, rather than sending an email. He picked up on the third ring. I explained what I'd found, reading him the entry verbatim, including the timestamp and the temperature value. There was a pause. He said, "That's a new one." I asked if Cascade had sent anyone else to the station. He said not that he knew of, but he'd check with the ops team. I asked if there was any way the logger could be generating that kind of entry from stored data, the temperature value, the assessment of the heating cycle, and he said he supposed something was possible if the logger's automated diagnostic routines were writing to the maintenance log, which was not supposed to happen, but which he admitted he'd never explicitly verified couldn't happen. He said he'd follow up by the end of the week. He called me back on Friday. He'd talked to ops and to the technical support team for the data logger manufacturer. Nobody at Cascade had been to the station. The data logger's automated diagnostics did write periodic status checks to a separate internal file, but they were not supposed to appear in the maintenance log, and there was no configuration for them to appear under a technician identifier. The firmware support team was at a loss. Tom said, "I want to be honest with you. I don't have a clean explanation for this." I asked whether I should be concerned about someone unauthorized accessing the station. He thought about it, said the stations were technically unsecured in the sense that there was no lock on the instrument enclosure, only the keypad entry for the logger itself, which required the contractor's access code, and that it wasn't unprecedented for curious hikers or hunters to poke around remote installations without causing damage. "But at 3 in the morning in November," I said. "Yeah," he said. "That's the part that doesn't quite fit." He said he'd document it and loop in NOAA's network operations contact, a woman named Lena Kowalski at the Missoula Forecast Office, and that if there were further unexplained entries, I should let him know immediately. I thought about it on the drive home. 43 miles of two-lane highway, and then the interstate, and I thought about it almost the whole way. Who would drive to an unmaintained mountain road in the middle of November, navigate 11 miles of frozen ruts in the dark, and then perform a legitimate instrument check on a weather station at 3:41 in the morning? A technician, maybe, but not one I'd been told about, and not one who left any physical trace at the station that I'd been able to detect. The road showed signs of my truck's previous passages, tire impressions that had frozen into the surface and then been smoothed by wind-blown snow. I had looked at those impressions on my way in that morning, and they looked like my impressions from the previous week, nothing superimposed, no other vehicle tracks that I could clearly identify, but I hadn't been looking for other tracks. I'd been driving, watching the road conditions. I hadn't been examining the surface for evidence that someone else had been there. I told myself I would pay more attention next week. December arrived and the road got harder. The snow was sticking in the shaded sections even through the midday sun, and I had the chains on every visit from the second week of the month onward. The temperatures at the station were regularly in the single digits, and a couple of times below zero, and the work became more physical in the way that cold makes everything more physical. Your hands have less dexterity, your tools are stiff, the latches on the enclosure are sticky with frost, and you have to work them carefully or you'll crack the housing. I started bringing a thermos of coffee and a hand warmer pack tucked inside my glove. I started wearing my insulated Carhartt bib overalls over my field clothes, which made me look slightly absurd and felt completely necessary. I found myself spending more time at the station on these winter visits than I had in fall, partly because the cold made everything take longer, but also because I was examining things more carefully. Not obsessively, not in any way that compromised my objectivity, just more carefully. I was looking at the ground around the installation for marks. I was looking at the enclosure latches for scratches or compression marks that weren't consistent with my own tool use. I was looking at the logger keypad for smudges that might tell me something about hand placement. These are all reasonable things to look for. I had a legitimate professional reason to document any signs of unauthorized access to the installation. The fact that I was also partly motivated by something I can only describe as unease did not make the observations invalid. There were no new T2 entries in December. 2 visits, both clean. My own T1 entries from each previous visit were present and correct. The station was functioning well, if working hard. The snow depth sensor was recording consistently, and the barometric data was solid, feeding into the NWS's winter storm forecasting for the region. Lena Kowalski at the Missoula Forecast Office had apparently been in contact with Tom about the unexplained entries, because Tom sent me an email in early December saying that NOAA had reviewed the data transmission records and couldn't identify any anomalies in the automated uplinks that would explain the T2 entries. No firmware solution had been found. They were monitoring. I felt a bit better about the whole thing over those 2 December visits. The most convincing explanation I'd settled on was that someone, a retired technician, a curious hunter, someone with some connection to the station's past, had accessed the equipment in early November, performed what appeared to be a legitimate inspection of 1 or 2 components, and logged it. This was strange and probably a violation of the access protocols, but not necessarily sinister. Remote instrument stations accumulate people who have some attachment to them, former technicians, researchers who visited, rangers who use them as trail landmarks. Someone might have driven up to check on the place for reasons that made sense to them and not thought much about the fact that they were entering data under an old technician identifier. It was thin, but it was something I could fit into the shape of the world I knew. Then on the second Tuesday of January, I drove out in 20 below conditions with the heater in my truck running full blast and the frost so thick on the windshield that I had to stop twice to let the defroster catch up. And I got to the station and found 3 new T2 entries in the log. Not 1, 3. The first was from Christmas Eve at 11:58 in the evening. T2 anemometer bearing check. Rotation smooth. No bearing wear. The second was from December 28th at 5:22 in the morning. T2 tipping bucket funnel clear. No blockage. The third was from January 4th at 1:45 in the morning. T2 solar panel angle nominal. Surface clear of snow. 3 entries over 11 days, all in the deep of night, all recording legitimate instrument observations that would be consistent with a knowledgeable technician making routine checks. I was supposed to be the only technician at this station. I stood in -20-degree air and read those entries 3 times each. My face was getting numb from the cold, and I had my work done, and I should have closed the enclosure and gotten back in the truck, but I stood there reading them. The entries described real conditions. The anemometer bearing, I had checked it myself this visit, as I always did. The shaft rotated smoothly, no detectable bearing wear. That was correct. The solar panel surface, when I'd arrived this morning, had been clear of snow, which was slightly unusual because there had been some accumulation during the previous week, meaning someone, something, had cleared it at some point between the last accumulation event and now. I looked at the panels. They were mounted at about a 30-degree angle on the south-facing mount. The snow around the base of the mount was untracked, at least to my eye, though the wind had been blowing for the past week, and any tracks from a visit before Christmas would have been long since buried. I photographed everything. Both panels, the mount, the snow surface around the mount, the area around the enclosure. I photographed the logger screen with all 3 entries visible. I stood back and photographed the whole station from the access gate. I noted the time, 9:32 in the morning. I noted the temperature, -19, confirmed by the station's own sensors. I noted that the solar panels were clear of snow. I noted that the anemometer bearing was smooth. Then I got in the truck and called Tom Geary from the cab. He didn't pick up. I called Ruth Daly, and she answered on the first ring. I described what I'd found. She said she'd get Tom to call me back today. I said that was fine, that I was sitting in my truck at the station, and it was -19, and I was going to drive back down in a few minutes. She asked if I was okay, and I said yes, which was true in most respects. Tom called back around noon, while I was on the highway south of Drummond. He was quiet for a long time after I read him the entries. Then he said that he was going to recommend that Cascade formally report this to the Forest Service, since the access road crossed Forest Service land, and that we should probably also loop in NOAA's network security contact, rather than just their operations contact. He said he was sorry I'd had to deal with this without any kind of heads up. I asked him what he thought was going on. Another pause. Honestly, Daniel, I don't know. But 3 entries over 11 days, all at night, all technically accurate? That's not a data artifact. That's someone with access and knowledge. I asked if Kevin Maurer, the previous technician, had any reason to still be visiting the station. Tom said he'd moved to Colorado and that his access code had been deactivated when his contract ended. The access code, I said. The logger keypad access code. If it's deactivated, these entries couldn't have been entered through the keypad. Tom was quiet. So how are they getting into the log? I asked. He said he didn't know. He said the logger's communication interface was password protected and had logging of its own that should show any remote access attempts. He said the tech support team would do a full audit. I drove the rest of the way to Missoula, thinking about the 2 things that didn't fit together. The entries were technically accurate, describing real conditions at the station, but the access code for T2 was deactivated, meaning whoever or whatever was creating these entries was doing so without standard access, and they were doing it in the middle of the night in midwinter at a remote mountain site. The technical audit came back negative a week later. No remote access attempts in the logger's communication logs. No evidence of firmware manipulation. The T2 identifier was inactive in the configuration file, which meant that by rights it shouldn't have been able to generate entries at all, and yet there they were in the log, with timestamps and observation content. The tech support engineer's written assessment, which Tom forwarded to me, was 3 paragraphs of careful professional language that said, in essence, they had no explanation. I started keeping a closer eye on the road. I have a tool in my truck. I've carried it for years from my survey work, called a rolling measure, a wheeled device for measuring distances along irregular surfaces. That January, I started using it to measure the precise width of the tire ruts in the access road. My truck is a 2019 F-150 with a standard track width of 65.9 inches, and I knew what my own tires looked like in snow and soft ground. I documented the rut dimensions on each visit, the width, the depth, the tread pattern where it was visible. I found nothing conclusive for 3 weeks. The ruts were consistent with my own vehicle. The wind and temperature cycles were obliterating fine detail between visits. On my 4th January visit, which was also my 13th overall, running on 4 months at the station now, I found a section about 2 miles up the Forest Service road where the snow had been packed down in a way that was different from the surrounding surface. Not clearly a tire track, not an animal trail, just a section of road, maybe 40 feet long, where the snow had been compressed into a smoother surface than the wind-affected crust around it. I photographed it and noted the location in my notebook. I measured the width, approximately 68 inches, slightly wider than my own track. That could mean anything. Frost heave, wind effect, someone else accessing the road for legitimate purposes. The Forest Service uses these roads sometimes in winter for specific operations. I noted it without drawing conclusions. The T2 entries continued. Through January, there were 2 more. One at 4:11 in the morning on January 18th, reading T2 battery voltage check, 12.4 volts nominal, propane cycle check nominal, and one at 2:58 on January 25th, reading T2 snow depth sensor verified, reading 41 inches, consistent with visual. 41 inches of snow on January 25th. I verified this on my next visit. The sensor was reading 43 inches at that point, having received about 2 inches of new snowfall since the entry date, consistent with visual, as the entry said. 41 inches is a real number. It's not a number pulled from a configuration file. It's a measurement. I called Tom again, read him the entries. He was less surprised than he'd been before, which I wasn't sure was a good thing. He said NOAA and Cascade were in discussion about options, which seemed to mean they were discussing it without reaching any conclusions. He said they were looking into whether there was any authorized remote sensing or research program operating in that area that might have instrumentation near AWS 14 that could be interfering with the logger in some way. I asked what kind of interference could cause a remote sensor to generate text entries under a specific technician identifier describing accurate observations at a weather station. He didn't have an answer for that. I had a harder time sleeping through January. Not badly, not lying awake staring at the ceiling for hours, just waking at 2 or 3 in the morning and lying there for 20 or 30 minutes with my mind running over the logistics of it. Someone was at the station in the middle of the night. They had knowledge of the instruments and how to operate the logger. They weren't leaving evidence I could find. They knew the station well enough to make technically accurate entries about conditions. The station sat 43 miles from the nearest town, accessible by a single unpaved road that was extremely difficult to navigate in deep winter. The valley at the station's elevation typically had recorded temperatures between -10 and -25 on January nights. The work they were doing, the T2 entries described legitimate instrument checks, would require physically opening the enclosure, interacting with the keypad, walking between instruments. In temperatures I would not personally have wanted to work in without serious preparation. Who does that? Not as a prank, not as casual curiosity. That kind of winter work at that kind of location requires preparation, equipment, knowledge, and purpose. And they were doing it consistently. One of the things I found myself doing in those January weeks was trying to map the frequency. The first T2 entry I'd found was in early November, then a gap until later November, then nothing through the 2 December visits I'd made, then 3 entries over 11 days around the Christmas to New Year period, when I hadn't been to the station, then 2 more in January, on the 18th and 25th, both on nights when I wasn't scheduled to visit. The pattern, if it was a pattern, seemed to be that the T2 entries appeared during the gaps between my own visits. Not never when I was present. I hadn't been present overnight, but concentrated in the windows between Tuesday visits. I wrote this observation in my notebook on January 27th, and then sat looking at it for a while. It could mean that whoever was doing this was aware of my schedule, which meant they were either monitoring the station's activity, the logger communicated with the relay network on a regular cycle, and anyone who could access those communications could, in theory, detect the pattern of my visits, or they had some other way of knowing when the station was unmanned. Both options were uncomfortable. I did not tell Carol about any of this. We were not in a place where that conversation would have made sense. I did tell Phil Henriksen, in a phone call in late January, not because I expected him to have answers, but because I needed to say it to someone outside the professional chain. Phil listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of his better qualities. When I was done, he asked a few practical questions. Did I feel physically threatened? Had I noticed anything at the site that suggested a human presence? What did Cascade actually think was happening? I told him I didn't feel threatened. I hadn't found conclusive physical evidence, and Cascade didn't know. Phil said, "Are you thinking about quitting?" I thought about that. I said no, not yet. The work itself was fine. I wasn't scared of the station or the drive. I was more troubled than scared, which are different states. Phil said that seemed reasonable, and we talked about other things for a while, and the call ended, and I went to bed. February. In February, the entries accelerated. I want to be precise about this. In November, there had been 1 entry, in my absence. In December, nothing I found. Over the Christmas to January period, I'd found 5 entries total, all at night, all during my absence. In February, over the 4 weeks of the month and 2 scheduled visits, I found 11 T2 entries in the log. 11. They ranged across the month, appearing roughly every 3 to 4 days. Most of them described routine instrument checks, bearing inspections, enclosure temperature readings, sensor verification, but a few were different. On February 8th at 12:53 in the morning, T2 ice bridging in precip funnel, cleared, manually activated heater element. This was a real maintenance intervention. The tipping bucket rain gauge has a small heating element in the funnel that can be manually activated to prevent ice bridging, a condition where ice forms across the funnel opening and prevents precipitation from being recorded. The fact that the entry documented the problem and the solution meant either the automatic heating had failed and been manually overridden, or the heater had been intentionally activated for some other reason. When I checked the precip gauge on my next visit, the funnel was clear and the heating element was showing signs of recent activation. A slight discoloration of the inner funnel surface that wasn't consistent with the condition I'd left it in the previous week. On February 15th, at 4:04 in the morning, T2 north panel snow accumulation corrected. One of the solar panels had a design quirk. Its tilt angle occasionally caused snow to accumulate asymmetrically along the northern edge rather than sliding off cleanly, which I had been managing by clearing it during my visits. The entry on the 15th indicated this had been corrected between my visits. When I checked the panel on February 19th, the surface was clean and the snow around the base showed a disturbed pattern, as if something had cleared the panel and the displaced snow had fallen. On February 22nd, at 3:18 in the morning, T2 checked data logger clock, offset 4 seconds, corrected. The data logger's real-time clock drifts slowly over time and should be periodically synchronized to the GPS-corrected network time. I synchronized it on every visit, which was in my maintenance protocol. An independent clock synchronization on a specific date between my visits was either impossible, the logger doesn't sync automatically except through the telemetry system, which would log such a sync under a different entry type, or it had been performed manually by someone with access to the keypad. I documented all of this. I sent Tom an updated summary by email with photographs and my own observations about the maintenance activities described in the entries. I wrote it in a factual, technical tone, the same way I would write any field report, because it was the way I knew how to write, and because the content was alarming enough without me adding alarmed language to it. Tom called me the same evening. He said, "The clock sync entry, that's the one that's going to be hard to explain away." I agreed. He said that Cascade and NOAA were now formally treating this as an unauthorized access situation and were going to involve the Forest Service law enforcement arm. I asked what they expected to find. He said probably nothing. Remote installation access violations were hard to prosecute because they were hard to detect, and the perpetrator was long gone by any investigation, but it needed to be on record. I asked again, had he looked into the history of the T2 designation? Who was T2 before my contract started? He said the designation had been used during a period 3 to 4 years ago when the station had been on a 2-person maintenance rotation. One technician had been Kevin Maurer, who I already knew about. The second technician during that period had been a man named Gary Tillman, who had also held the station manager role for the broader region. Gary Tillman had retired about 3 years ago. I asked if Tom had Gary Tillman's contact information. There was a pause. He said he wasn't sure if he had it on file. He said he'd look and let me know. I want to note something here about Tom Geary, because I think it matters. From everything I observed in our professional relationship, Tom was a competent and honest person. He was not evasive with me. He answered my questions directly and followed up when he said he would. But there were moments in our conversations about the T2 situation, this being one of them, where I noticed a slight hesitation before an answer that wouldn't normally require hesitation. Not deception exactly. More like someone being careful about what they committed to. He got back to me 3 days later. He said he didn't have Gary Tillman's current contact information, that Tillman had left the company without a forwarding address on file, and that HR's records for retired personnel were somewhat thin. He said he'd asked around with some of the longer-term Cascade staff and hadn't found anyone who was in current contact with Tillman. A man who'd worked at the company for, presumably, many years, and nobody had a current phone number or email for him. I filed that away. The Forest Service law enforcement officer, a man named Archer, though whether that was his first or last name I was never clear on, he just introduced himself as Archer, came out to the station with me on my next visit in late February. He was a solid, quiet man in his 40s, with a USFC's badge and a sidearm and an attitude of professional skepticism that I found appropriate. I walked him through the situation, showed him the entries in the log, walked the perimeter with him. He took notes and photographs. He found two things I hadn't found. He has a trained eye for these situations in a way that I don't. First, approximately 30 feet north of the instrument tower, on the downhill side of the clearing, he found what he identified as compressed snow in a roughly oval pattern, roughly 6 feet by 4 feet. He said it was consistent with someone having lain or sat in that spot for some time. The snow was compacted enough that it had partially refrozen into a denser layer, suggesting it had been used before the last several days' fresh snowfall had partially covered it. Second, on the south face of the fence enclosure, partially behind a fence T-post, he found a piece of equipment I didn't recognize. It was roughly the size of a deck of cards, housed in a black weatherproof case with what appeared to be a short antenna stub and a small magnet mount. He photographed it carefully before touching it. He removed it, bagged it in an evidence bag. He said he thought it was a remote sensor of some kind. He said he'd have it looked at. I asked if he thought it was related to the log entries. He said he couldn't say yet. I asked if it could be some kind of device that could interact with the data logger remotely. He said the data logger communication interface was proprietary and encrypted, and that he didn't know enough about the specifics to say whether a device like this could interface with it. The device turned out to be, I found this out weeks later, through Tom, who had gotten the information from Archer, a commercially available GPS data logger, a trail camera alternative essentially, that records location, motion events, and time-stamped data. The device Archer found had apparently been recording ambient sensor data from the weather station's own output, reading the station's radio telemetry transmissions, which are broadcast on a publicly receivable frequency and are unencrypted, not writing to the station's logs, not interfacing with the data logger, just receiving and recording the station's transmissions. The device was not, as far as Archer could determine, the source of the T2 entries. So whoever was placing entries in the log was doing something the GPS receiver wasn't doing. The receiver was a passive listener. The T2 entries required active input. Archer submitted his report to the Forest Service, which submitted a notification to NOAA, which filed it in the appropriate administrative record. Nobody told me the investigation had produced any leads. Nobody told me it was closed. It just seemed to lose momentum, as these things do when the evidence is too strange to fit into a clear category. March brought some relief in the weather, at least at lower elevations. The access road became passable without chains by mid-March, and the temperatures during my visits climbed back into the low 20s, which felt practically warm after February. The snowpack at the station was still substantial. The depth sensor was reading 38 inches in early March, and the station's data during this period was particularly useful to the snowpack modeling programs because the spring melt timing was critical information for downstream water resource planning. I continued my visits every Tuesday. I continued logging everything. I submitted my reports on schedule. I kept my own parallel notebook running. The T2 entries also continued. Through March, there were 7 of them. Most were routine in the way the earlier entries had been routine, bearing checks, enclosure temperatures, sensor verifications, but 3 stood out. On March 7th at 2:01 in the morning, T2 replaced tipping bucket bearing seal, part from on-site spare kit. The tipping bucket mechanism had a small O-ring seal on the pivot bearing that could dry out and crack, causing the bucket to tip irregularly. The spare parts kit in the weatherproof bin contained, among other things, a set of replacement seals. When I inspected the mechanism on March 12th, the seal appeared new. Not cracked, not dried, perfectly pliable. The spare kit was short by exactly 1 seal. Someone had used the on-site parts to make a repair. On March 19th at 3:56 in the morning, T2 found and removed mouse nest from inside battery enclosure. No wire damage. I found no mouse nest when I opened the enclosure on March 26th, but I found traces of nesting material, small scraps of dry grass and rodent-chewed insulation in the lower left corner of the enclosure where a small gap in the weather stripping allowed access. The material was consistent with a nest having recently been removed rather than never having existed. And on March 29th, at 1:23 in the morning, T2 noted cracked junction box cover on soil temperature probe array, not in spare kit. Will monitor. I checked the junction box cover on my next visit. It was cracked, a hairline fracture across the upper left corner that I had either missed on previous visits or that had developed recently. The spare kit didn't have a replacement cover. I ordered one and filed the repair in my own log. Here is the thing about that last entry that I kept returning to. T2 noted a problem, determined the part wasn't in the spare kit, and noted that they would monitor it. They then presumably didn't return before my next visit, or did return and confirmed the part was still unavailable. This is not behavior consistent with a data artifact. This is behavior consistent with a person who is tracking a maintenance issue over time and responding to it with the kind of judgment a professional technician exercises. They couldn't fix it immediately, so they noted it and planned to watch it. Which is what I would have done. Which is what I did do, independently, when I found the same crack. 2 technicians, separately, finding the same problem within a week of each other, making the same assessment, entering similar notes in the same log. The difference being that I was the contracted technician assigned to this station, and the other one was doing this in the middle of the night, apparently, every 3 or 4 days, without any formal authorization and without leaving any trace I could definitively identify. I want to say something here about what this felt like from the inside. I've been trying to describe it as a technical and investigative situation, which it was, but the emotional dimension of it was also real, and I'd be dishonest to leave it out. It felt like being watched, not watched the way a camera watches you, passively and without engagement, watched the way another professional watches you, attentively, with knowledge of what you're doing and why, with the ability to assess whether you're doing it correctly. I would arrive at the station on Tuesday morning and go through my inspection, and in the back of my mind, I would be aware that someone else had been here since my last visit and had done the same things I was doing, or some of them, and had entered them in the same log where my own entries lived. The log itself began to feel different because of this. It had been a technical document, a record of work. Now every time I opened it on the logger screen, I was reading a conversation. My entries on Tuesday mornings, their entries in the middle of the night, back and forth across the log in alternating lines without any direct address. There's something I want to be careful about saying here, because I know how it sounds. But in February and March, lying awake at 2 or 3 in the morning in my room in Missoula, I started to think about the fact that the T2 entries described work that I would be doing on my next visit. Not exactly the same work. I had a set protocol and I checked everything on a consistent schedule, but overlapping with my work in a meaningful way. The anemometer bearing I would check on Tuesday, they had checked on Saturday. The enclosure temperature I would record at 9 in the morning, they had recorded at 3 in the morning. The solar panel I would clear of accumulated snow, they had cleared 3 days before I arrived. This sounds written out like they were helping me. I don't know if that's the right word for it. But I started noticing that when the T2 entries mentioned a specific condition or issue, I found that condition or issue when I arrived. The ice bridge in the precip funnel, cleared before I got there. The mouse nest, already removed. The junction box crack, already noted. It was like the work was being done twice. Once by them, once by me. And I couldn't tell if they knew I would be coming or whether they were doing the work because the station needed it regardless of who I was. I called Tom in early April and said I wanted to discuss the history of the station in more detail. Not the technical history, the personnel history. He sounded slightly cautious but agreed. He told me that AWS 14 had been installed under a contract managed by NOAA's Western Region office, with Cascade as the maintenance provider from the beginning. The original technician had been a local contractor whose name Tom couldn't immediately recall, who'd managed the station for the first 3 years. Then there'd been a period of two-person rotation with Maurer and Tillman, who was also managing several other stations in the region. Then Maurer alone for a couple of years. Then about an 8-month gap in contracted maintenance. Tom was vague about why, said there'd been a contracting review, and then me. An 8-month gap. I asked him what had happened to the station during those 8 months. He said the station had continued operating on its automated systems. Monthly visual checks had been done by a Forest Service employee as a courtesy arrangement, but no formal maintenance contract had been in place. I asked if the Forest Service employees' checks were logged. He said they had submitted written reports to the Forest Service, not to Cascade's system, and that he didn't have access to those reports. I asked if the data logger's T2 entries could date from that period. He said, and I could hear that he was thinking carefully before speaking, that the timestamp data on the entries was current, not historical. If the entries had been written during the gap period, the timestamps would reflect those earlier dates. But the timestamps are recent, I said. Yes, he said. So whoever is making these entries is doing it now, not replaying historical data from a different period. That's my understanding, he said. I asked who Gary Tillman was, specifically, what he was like, what his background had been. Tom said he'd only overlapped with Tillman for about a year, before Tillman retired, and that Tillman had been an experienced field technician with deep knowledge of the Northern Rockies station network, someone who'd been with Cascade for a long time and was highly regarded professionally. He described Tillman as methodical, thorough, somewhat solitary by temperament. I asked, was there anything unusual about his retirement, the way he left? Another of those careful pauses. Tom said, I wasn't involved in whatever that process was. That was before my time in my current role. I know that he retired, and that the retirement was, I don't know what word to use, not contested, but not what anyone expected either. He was young to retire, I think, mid-50s. Mid-50s, healthy working age for a field technician. The kind of age where you retire if you have to or if something has happened, not simply because you feel finished. Tom, I said, I need you to level with me. Is there anything in the history of this station or this contract that I should know about and haven't been told? The pause this time was longer. I genuinely don't know the full history, he said finally. What I've told you is what I know. Some of the context from before I was in this role is not well documented. Not well documented, I said. I'll put it this way, he said. If I had something specific I was withholding, I would tell you. I'm not in the business of keeping my technicians in the dark in ways that affect their safety, but there are things about this station's history that I think I don't know, which is different. I believed him. I still believe him. I think Tom Geary was a straightforward person who had stumbled into managing a situation he didn't have full context for, and who was doing his best to be honest within the limits of what he actually knew. But someone at Cascade, or at NOAA, had more context than Tom, and whoever that was hadn't seen fit to share it with me. April. The snow at the station was starting to recede. The depth sensor was reading 22 inches by mid-month, down from nearly 50 at the February peak. The access road was clear enough to drive without chains from the first week of April on. The spring melt was running a bit early based on the station's temperature records for the preceding winters, which Lena Kowalski mentioned in a brief email she sent through Tom, confirming that our data was being used in the snowpack assessment reports, a professional courtesy acknowledgement. Nothing unusual in the content, but the fact that she reached out at all made me wonder if Tom had told her about the ongoing situation with the log entries. I replied and asked if she had a moment to talk. She called me 2 days later. She was brisk in the way that people at operational forecast offices are when their time is limited, but she was not unfriendly. I explained the T2 situation to her, the entries, the technical accuracy, the maintenance activities documented, the physical evidence Archer had found, and what it had turned out to be. She listened without interrupting, which meant she'd probably already heard some version of this from Tom or from the NOAA network operations side. When I finished, she said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that it's not a dismissive question. It's genuinely relevant. I said okay. Is there any possibility that you're making the entries yourself without being fully aware of it? I had expected this question, in the sense that I'd thought about it myself. If you're going to be rigorous about ruling out explanations, you have to consider all of them, including uncomfortable ones. I told her that I had checked the logger timestamps against my own verified location records, my truck's mileage log, my Garfield Street gas receipts, my Tuesday morning departure records, and that the T2 entry timestamps corresponded to times when I was demonstrably not at the station. The entry from Christmas Eve at 11:58 in the evening, I had been in Missoula that entire week, which I could verify from my receipts and from the fact that I had attended a Christmas Eve gathering at a coworker's home and was provably in the city. The entry from January 4th, I had been working from my apartment on contract paperwork and had exchanged multiple emails with Tom during the afternoon and evening of that day. I was in Missoula. The station was a 2-hour drive away in January road conditions. She said, "Okay, I believe you. I had to ask." I told her I understood. Then I asked her if the name Gary Tillman meant anything to her. There was a brief silence that I noticed. "I know the name," she said. "He managed several of the region's stations for a while." "Did you know him personally?" "We interacted professionally. He was good at the work." "Do you know why he retired?" Another small silence. I heard it was health-related, but I didn't know him well enough that I would have the details. "Health-related," I said. "That's what I understood. But I want to be clear that I'm not sure about that. It's what I heard." I asked if she knew anything about what happened at the station during the 8-month gap in the maintenance contract. She said she did know there had been a gap, and that it had been flagged in the data quality records for that period because the monthly visual checks by the Forest Service employee had been sporadic. She said one of the reasons my data was particularly valued was that it had restored the continuity of the record after a period where there had been gaps. I asked if she knew why the contract had lapsed. She said she didn't have visibility into Cascade's contracting decisions. I believe she was being honest about that too, but I kept coming back to the cluster of things I didn't know. Why the contract had lapsed, why Gary Tillman had retired at mid-50s with no forwarding address on file, what had happened at the station during those 8 months. The spring visits settled into a different rhythm than the winter ones. The work was less physically demanding without the extreme cold, and I found I was spending more time doing careful observation work and less time managing the physical effects of the weather. In April and into May, I started doing something I hadn't done on winter visits, which was to walk the clearing perimeter beyond the fence, into the tree line, looking for evidence of camp or passage. I found some things, not definitive things, but some. On a south-facing slope, about 90 feet from the station fence, in a stand of lodgepole pine that provided cover from the prevailing wind, I found a flattened area of ground that could have been a camping spot. The vegetation was compressed in a way consistent with something heavy, a tent, a sleeping system, repeatedly placed in the same spot. It was hard to date. The area around AWS 14 was part of the general backcountry and could plausibly have been used by hunters or hikers without any connection to the station. But the spot was directly oriented toward the station, with a clear sightline through the trees to the instrument tower. I photographed it and noted it in my report. I found, on the same visit, the stub of a wooden dowel or stake, maybe 8 inches long and an inch in diameter, driven into the ground about 15 feet outside the station's north fence. It was old enough to have some weathering on the exposed portion, but not so old that it had been swallowed into the ground. When I pulled it out, the buried end was clean and pointed. There was nothing attached to it, no wire, no flagging tape, just a driven stake with no obvious current purpose. I left it in place and photographed it. I didn't pull it out. I sent the photographs to Tom as part of my regular report. He acknowledged receipt and passed them to Archer at the Forest Service. Archer came back with, "Nothing conclusive. May." In May, the entries in the log changed character slightly, and I've thought about this shift more than almost anything else in the entire situation. Prior to May, all of the T2 entries were about the instruments, about the station's equipment and its condition. Technical language, instrument designations, measurement values, the kind of notes a conscientious technician makes about the work. The entry from May 3rd at 3:29 in the morning read, T2, good spring this year, meadow green, to fence line, meadow birds active. I read that entry 6 times. Then I read it again. Not a maintenance observation, not an equipment check, a remark about the spring, about the meadow being green and the birds being active. An observation of the kind you make when you have been to a place many times over many years and you are measuring the current season against the memory of previous seasons. Good spring this year. I did not contact Tom immediately. I sat in my truck in the clearing for a long time with the engine off, looking at the meadow, which was green to the fence line. It was green. The spring grass had come in well after the snowpack receded, a bright, thin green that covered the clearing right to the edges of the wire fence. And there were birds. I'd noticed them when I drove in, a meadowlark singing from somewhere east of the tower, mountain bluebirds working the fence posts. Whoever had entered this note had stood here, or sat here, or knelt here, at 3:29 in the morning on May 3rd, and had looked at the meadow in the dark, or in whatever pre-dawn light existed at that hour, and had decided to log an observation about the season. I don't know why this unsettled me more than everything else. Maybe because the other entries were explicable, at least in outline. You could imagine a scenario where an unauthorized technician was performing unauthorized maintenance and entering their work in the log, strange and inexplicable as the mechanics of it might be. That was a human scenario, even a bizarre one. But this entry was different. This was the entry of someone who felt something about the place, who was paying attention not just to the instruments, but to the meadow itself, to the birds, to the quality of the season, and they were doing it alone, in the dark, in the middle of the night. I called Tom and read him the entry. The silence on the line was longer than usual. He said, "I don't know what to tell you, Daniel." I said, "Does Gary Tillman still visit this station?" "I genuinely don't know where Gary Tillman is," Tom said, "but if you had to guess, I wouldn't guess about something like this." I let that hang for a moment. How long did he work this station? Several years. I'd have to look at the actual contract records. "Can you look at them?" He said he would. He called back the next day and said that Gary Tillman had been associated with AWS 14 in various capacities for approximately 9 years, which was a longer period than I'd understood. He'd been the regional station manager who'd overseen the original installation, and then when the 2-person rotation had been set up, he'd been one of the rotating technicians, with T2 being his designation. He and Kevin Maurer had maintained the station together for about 3 years. And then Maurer continued alone and Tillman retired, I said. "That's what the records show." 9 years, I said. He maintained this station, in some capacity, for 9 years. Yes, I thought about that. About what 9 years of weekly or near-weekly visits to a remote place would do to your relationship to that place. About whether it was possible to spend 9 years checking the same instruments in the same clearing on the edge of the same alpine meadow and not feel something that went beyond the professional. Good spring this year. I thought about the flattened area in the lodgepoles oriented toward the station, about the compacted snow oval Archer had found, about the fact that whoever this was seemed to work the station in the middle of the night, in the dead of winter, in temperatures that would be genuinely dangerous without the right equipment. Someone was sleeping near the station, or had slept there. Someone was visiting the station in the early morning hours with enough regularity to make the meadow's spring green a reference point. Someone who knew where the spare parts were kept, who knew how to access the logger, who knew when the tipping bucket needed its seal replaced. Someone who had been doing this, apparently, for years, possibly since before my contract started. The absence of T2 entries in my early weeks at the station might simply mean that this person had taken a break, or that their entries during that period had been overwritten by the logger's memory management before I checked. Or it might mean something else that I couldn't work out. I started leaving notes. This was not part of my official duties. Tom didn't know I was doing it. I'm not sure it was a good idea, looking back, but at the time it felt like the only action available to me that didn't require institutional involvement, and that preserved some possibility of a direct human answer. I wrote the notes on waterproof paper, the kind designed for field use in wet conditions, and I left them inside the instrument enclosure, weighted under the spare parts kit where someone opening the enclosure would find them, but the weather wouldn't affect them. The first note said, "I know you've been here. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I'm just trying to understand. My name is Daniel, and I maintain this station under a Cascade contract. If you want to talk, here's my number." I left my cell number. I checked on the note the following week. It was gone. A new note had appeared in its place. Same waterproof paper, handwritten in small, careful printed letters, the kind of handwriting that comes from years of filling in field forms. It said, "It's okay. I know who you are. Don't worry about it." I read that 3 times. Then I took a photograph of it and put it in my jacket pocket. I wrote my own response on a new piece of waterproof paper and left it. "I'm not worried. I'd like to talk. I have questions. Are you Gary Tillman?" The following week, the response was, "Yes, it was my station for a long time. I come back when I can. Easier in some seasons than others. I try not to interfere." I sat in the clearing with that note for a while. The late May sun was warm enough to sit in, and the meadow birds were still active, a savanna sparrow calling from somewhere in the grass. It should have felt like a resolution. I had an answer, at least to the identity question. Gary Tillman, former station manager, former T2, someone who'd spent 9 years here and clearly couldn't stop. But it raised more questions than it answered. The log entries. He was entering them under the T2 identifier, which Tom had told me was deactivated. How was he accessing the logger? His entry code was supposed to have been wiped. And why was he doing it? Not the visiting. I thought I understood something about the visiting, about what a place like this might mean to someone who'd spent years with it. But why enter the log? Why leave a formal record of work that shouldn't officially exist? The next week's note. "How are you getting into the logger? Your access code was deactivated." He left it 2 days. Then the reply. "Not through the keypad. The logger has a direct interface port that accepts manual commands without the keypad authentication. It's in the service manual, but not the standard documentation. Most technicians don't know about it." I looked. He was right. At the bottom of the technical appendix of the service manual for the CR1000X, buried in a section about factory reset procedures, was documentation of a secondary command interface accessible through a specific port on the logger's communication board. It required knowledge and a specific cable adapter, but it bypassed the standard keypad authentication. It was designed for emergency access when the primary interface was unavailable. Someone who had been working with this logger for 9 years would know about that interface. A new technician would not. I wrote back, "Why do you still enter the logs? Why not just visit and not leave entries?" His reply, the following week, "The station should have complete records. It's not right for a station to have gaps. Someone should maintain the log, even when there's an official gap." That was the answer that stayed with me longest. Not because it was strange, but because it was the answer of someone whose relationship to the station had gone past contractual obligation and into something more like personal responsibility. The log should be complete. The station should be cared for. Someone should be there, whether the contract says so or not. And this was presumably the answer for the 8-month gap period too. When the maintenance contract had lapsed, he had kept the records anyway. Kept visiting, kept logging. Not because Cascade asked him to, not because NOAA required it, because the station required it, in some logic that was entirely his own. I thought about whether to tell Tom. I spent a week thinking about it. I thought about the fact that the Forest Service had opened a case and that Archer would want to know. I thought about the fact that an unauthorized person was accessing a federal instrumentation asset in a technically sophisticated way and had been doing so for years. I thought about the note. "It's okay. I know who you are. Don't worry about it." I wrote to him again. "I should report this. What would happen to you if I did?" His reply took 2 notes, since his answer was longer than usual. First note, "Nothing good for me. Probably nothing much in terms of federal charges. I haven't damaged anything. I haven't taken anything. I've only maintained. But they'd change the access port probably, and add a lock to the enclosure, and I wouldn't be able to come back. Second note, I understand if you need to report it. I'm not asking you to cover for me. I kept thinking about what Tom had said. Tom had said there were things about the station's history that he thought he didn't know, and Lena Kowalski had said that Tillman's retirement was health-related, with the hesitation of someone repeating something they weren't fully confident in. What had happened here, 9 years ago or before, or 3 years ago when the contract lapsed, or during those 8 months when the maintenance had technically stopped. I asked directly in my next note, what happened at this station? Why did you retire? What aren't I being told? He didn't answer the following week. There was no note in the enclosure. Either he hadn't been there, or he'd been there and chosen not to respond to that specific question. The week after that, the note was there but shorter than usual. Some things happened here that I don't entirely understand. I stayed longer than I should have. When I left, I thought I was done with it, but I wasn't. I read that several times. Some things happened here that I don't entirely understand. It was the least technical thing he had said since the first note, which had been precise and calm. This one had the texture of something reluctant. I wrote back, what things? No response for 2 weeks. 2 weeks, during which the T2 entries continued in the log, 4 of them across the 2 weeks. Routine maintenance checks, professional and technical, as if the silence in the notes was unrelated to the ongoing work. Routine instrument checks, an anemometer check, a precipitation gauge inspection, all accurate, all consistent with conditions I found when I arrived. The technician and the person who'd written the note in reluctant language were the same person. The work was not affected by whatever the question had opened. When the response came, it was longer than any previous note. He had used 2 sheets of waterproof paper, written on both sides in his small, careful printing. It said, and I am going to reproduce this as accurately as I can from memory because I no longer have the physical notes. I left them at the station after that season, which was a decision I've revisited many times. I was here alone a lot in the later years. The station is a good place to work, and I'm not complaining about that. But when you spend enough time at a place this isolated, things get a little strange in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. Not hallucinations. I'm not talking about anything like that. Just the sense that the place has an orientation toward you that other places don't have. You start to feel like the place is paying attention. Like your visits aren't just you visiting, but some kind of exchange. That probably sounds crazy written down. It sounds crazy to me. About 6 years in, things started to happen that I can't account for. Equipment that I had left in certain positions would be in slightly different positions when I returned. Not significantly different, a few inches, a degree of rotation, not enough to cause measurement error, just different. I documented it because I document everything, and then when I reviewed my documentation, I could never prove it wasn't my own misremembering. Human memory isn't precise enough to confirm a 2-inch displacement from week to week. But the snow. Snow is a record. Snow shows you what happened. In my 7th year, in the February of my 7th year, I found tracks in the snow from the fence to the tower and back. Roughly human footprints, but not quite the proportions I expected. Not quite the spacing. I photographed them. I have the photographs somewhere. When I showed them to a colleague, he said probably elk or deer that had gotten in through a gate gap. I looked at the photographs again, and they didn't look like elk tracks to me, but I also couldn't say what they looked like. After that February, things were different up here. Hard to say how exactly. The work was the same, the instruments were the same, but I started finding the log entries. Not mine, not Kevin's. A third identifier that wasn't in the configuration. Not T1, not T2, not T3. Just a character string that didn't match anything in the system. The entries were in the same format as ours, but the observations were slightly off. Wrong units, wrong terminology, details that weren't quite right in a way I couldn't pin down. Like a close imitation, like someone who had studied the logs and was approximating the format without fully understanding it. I reported this to Cascade at the time. That was the 8-month gap you mentioned. They pulled the contract, did a technical audit, found nothing conclusive, then re-established the contract with just Kevin after I'd retired. Kevin apparently didn't find anything unusual. Or if he did, he didn't report it. I didn't retire for health reasons. I retired because I had spent years at this place, and something had changed here that I couldn't explain, and when I tried to explain it to Cascade, they treated it the way you treat someone who's been alone too long in the field. They weren't cruel about it, just dismissive. I came back because I can't not come back. I know that's not rational, but when you've spent as long as I have with a station, you know its rhythms in a way that goes past professional familiarity. I know when something isn't right here, and I wanted to know if it was still happening. I've been coming back for 3 years. I haven't found those anomalous log entries again. The station is behaving normally. The instruments are functioning correctly. The data is clean. The place is just the place. Maybe whatever it was has stopped. Maybe I was wrong about what I thought I saw. 7 years of solo fieldwork in isolated conditions will do things to your perceptions that are hard to account for. I know that. But I keep coming back anyway. I'll keep coming back until I'm sure. I hope you understand. I'll stay out of your way as much as I can. Gary. I read those notes over the course of a whole afternoon sitting in my truck in the clearing. I read them multiple times. I looked up from them at intervals to look at the station, at the instrument tower, and the enclosure, and the pyranometer mount, at the meadow green to the fence and the ridge behind it. The meadow birds were still going. A hawk was working the updrafts over the western edge of the clearing. What do you do with something like that? I mean that practically, not rhetorically. What do you do when the explanation you've been working toward turns out to have a further explanation underneath it, and that further explanation is less like a solution and more like a different variety of problem? A third identifier that wasn't in the configuration. Entries in approximated format. Observations that were slightly off. I thought about the technical audit Cascade had done during the 8-month gap. What had they found? Tom had said they found nothing conclusive, but nothing conclusive is not the same as nothing, and nobody had told me the details of what the audit had looked at. I thought about Kevin Maurer in Colorado. Tom had said Maurer hadn't reported anything unusual, but had anyone asked him? Had anyone asked him specifically about the log entries? I wrote back to Gary that evening, using 2 pieces of waterproof paper. I asked him, did he still have the photographs of the tracks? Could he send them to me? And what exactly had the anomalous log entries said? Did he have copies? I asked him this second question because the logger had been the same unit for most of its operational life. CR1000X units are durable, and the contract didn't call for replacement unless there was a functional failure. And a 2-year memory buffer meant that entries from 3 years ago would no longer be in the internal memory. But external records, if Gary had saved them, might still exist. His response came back over 2 visits, in 2 separate notes. The first note said, I don't have the track photographs anymore. They were on a phone I no longer have. I know what I saw. I know it wasn't deer. The second note said, I have some partial records from the log entries. Not complete. I photographed some of the logger screens with my phone at the time, and I have those images, though the quality isn't great. I can send you what I have if you want. I'll need an email address. I left my email address. He sent 3 photographs. They arrived in my inbox 3 days after my next visit. He must have sent them when he was in range of some kind of connectivity, which meant he drove to town or had some mobile arrangement I wasn't aware of. The photographs were of the logger screen, as he'd said, and the quality was genuinely poor. Older phone camera, screen glare, slight motion blur, but the text was mostly legible. The first photograph showed 2 entries. The identifier column read, not T1, not T2. It read, a string of characters that looked like it could be a designation, but was different from anything else in the log. In the photograph, it looked like it might be T something, the second character obscured by glare. The observation text read, instrument array nominal, all sensors within expected range, station integrity, next observation. Not quite right, like Gary had said. The language was close, but slightly off. Cascade's format used specific abbreviations. Temp-RH for the temperature and humidity sensor, ANEM for the anemometer. These entries used fuller words. Observation, rather than INSPA, station integrity, rather than any term in Cascade's protocol. The second photograph showed a single entry in the same format. Precipitation record, noted accumulation of within expected seasonal range, station optimal. Station optimal, not a term in the Cascade vocabulary. The third photograph was different. It didn't show the maintenance log screen. It showed a different interface. Gary must have navigated to a different memory block, and what was visible was not a log entry, but something that looked like a raw data string, numbers and codes, the kind of output you'd see if you access the logger's binary data storage directly. Mixed into the data string, at intervals, were what appeared to be text fragments, not in the maintenance log format, just text, embedded in the raw data, returning, station nominal, expected range, season continuing, returning. I looked at that photograph for a long time. Returning, season continuing, returning. Not the language of a person maintaining a station, not the language of the log entries above it, the language of something making an observation about its own behavior, returning, as a statement of fact, as a note in a data stream, buried in the binary output of the logger's memory. I looked up Gary Tillman online. This is something I'd done before without finding much, but I tried again now with more specific search terms. I found his name in an archived professional directory from about 10 years ago, listed under Cascade Atmospheric Services as Regional Station Manager, Northern Rockies. I found his name in a NOAA-published data quality report from about 8 years ago, acknowledging the work of field technicians across the regional network. His name was in a list alongside Kevin Mauer's. I found nothing after that. No LinkedIn profile, no social media, no news mentions, no property records I could access online. He had become invisible after his retirement, in the way that some people do when they step back from their professional identity. I also searched for incidents at or near the station's general location. Nothing. No search and rescue records. No accident reports. No unusual events in the area over the past decade that I could find. Kevin Mauer was slightly more findable. I found him on LinkedIn. He worked for a water resources consulting firm in Denver, so the move to Colorado had been career lateral rather than a departure from the field. I sent him a connection request with a brief message that said I was his successor at the station and had some questions about the site if he had time to talk. He accepted the connection and replied within a day. He said, "Sure, what did I want to know?" I called him rather than messaging. He picked up after 2 rings, sounded normal, pleasant, the kind of relaxed professional friendliness that comes from being settled in your life and work. I told him I had some questions about the data logger and its log history. He said okay. I described, in neutral terms, the anomalous log entries I had found, mentioning the T2 entries in detail and briefly, carefully, mentioning that I was also aware of some older anomalies in the log that a previous technician had documented. I was vague about Gary by name because I didn't know how much Kevin knew about Gary's current situation, and I didn't want to make the call complicated before I got the information I wanted. Kevin was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Yeah, just that." Yeah, as in, he had heard this before. "You found entries like this?" I asked. "I found one," he said. "Maybe 2. In my last year there. I figured it was a logger glitch." "Did you report it?" I mentioned it to Tom, I think. Or maybe to whoever my Tom was at the time. I didn't make a big deal of it. It seemed like equipment. "What did the entries say?" He thought about it. One of them was something about precipitation accumulation. The other one, I can't remember exactly. Something about the station. Something not quite in our format. "Not quite in your format," I repeated. "A little off. Like I said, I thought it was equipment." I asked if he had noticed anything else unusual at the station in his time there. Physical things. Changes. He was quiet for a moment. "I found a set of footprints once. In the snow. Inside the fence perimeter. Not mine. Not elk. I couldn't figure out whose. I took pictures, but they were out of focus." A pause. "I also used to feel, this is going to sound weird, I used to feel like someone was watching me work. Not in a threatening way. Just a present kind of feeling. I assumed it was the isolation. 2 years at a remote station, you start to feel things. I said, "Did you ever feel like the station was well maintained? Better than you'd expect given the winter conditions?" He thought about this for a few seconds. "Yes, actually, I always thought I was just thorough, but now that you mention it, sometimes things were in better shape than I could account for. I'd show up after a bad week of weather, and things would be cleaner than the weather suggested they should be. I figured the enclosure was more weatherproof than the specs said." We talked for another few minutes. He was a good engineer and a good observer, and he had noticed the things I expected a good technician to notice. But he had filed them under equipment and isolation, and moved to Colorado and gotten on with his life. Before we hung up, he said, "Is something going on up there?" I said, "I don't fully know." He said, "Well, it's a weird station. I always felt like it had a personality." He laughed slightly, like someone expecting to be contradicted. "Probably that's stupid." I said, "Probably it isn't." June. The meadow was full green in June, and the ridge above the station was snow-free by the second week, the exposed rock visible in the clear, warm light. The snow depth sensor was reading 0. The spring bird activity had given way to the steadier, quieter presence of summer, the meadowlarks establishing territories, a pair of ferruginous hawks nesting somewhere on the east slope. The station itself was in excellent condition for the season transition, instruments clean and calibrated, the solar panels pulling good charge in the long June days. I had not reported Gary Tillman to Tom or to Archer. I had made this decision deliberately, and I was aware of its implications. I want to be clear that I understood what I was doing. I was not reporting an unauthorized presence at a federal instrumentation site that I was contractually responsible for. I was also aware that my reasons for not reporting were not entirely professional. Part of it was the notes, the tenor of them, the sense of someone who had a legitimate relationship to the place, even if that relationship had outgrown its official container. Part of it was the fact that the T2 work Gary was doing was, by any technical measure, good work, accurate, timely, sometimes anticipating problems I would otherwise have had to address under worse conditions. But part of it was the third thing, the other entries, the ones in the photographs. Returning, season continuing. I needed to understand what Gary had seen before I decided what to do with what he'd told me about it. The T2 entries were less frequent in June and July than they had been in the winter months. 3 in June, 2 in July, all routine. Gary had said he came back when he could, easier in some seasons than others, and I assumed summer was harder because the longer days made nighttime work more visually exposed and the access road condition was better, meaning other people used it. Hikers, hunters, the occasional Forest Service vehicle. In winter, the road was his alone. My own visits continued without interruption. I had now been at the station for 9 months, and the rhythm of the work had embedded itself into my week in the way that routines do when they're the steadiest thing in your life. Tuesday morning departures, 90 minutes to 2.5 hours at the station, Tuesday afternoon reports. The work itself was satisfying in the way that competent maintenance of anything is satisfying. You can see whether it's working, you can tell when something needs attention, and when you provide that attention and the thing works better, the cause and effect is legible. But the visits had also become something more than the work, in a way I was aware of and somewhat cautious about. I looked forward to them, not just the work, the place. I found myself checking the weather forecast for the ridge elevation on Saturday evenings and again on Monday, noting the expected conditions, planning which instruments might need extra attention based on what the previous week's weather had done. I thought about the station during the week in the way you think about things you're responsible for and also care about. Good spring this year, Gary had written. Meadow birds active. I understood that entry differently now. I understood it in my own body. You can't spend 9 months in a place like that and not develop some orientation toward it. Gary had 9 years. What I'd developed in 9 months, he'd had 9 years to deepen and then had been cut off from and apparently couldn't accept the loss of. In August, I wrote him a longer note than usual. I told him about Kevin Mauer's experience, the out-of-focus footprint photos, the feeling of being watched, the station being in better shape than the weather accounted for. I told him that what he'd described, the anomalous entries from a different identifier, had apparently also been present during Kevin's tenure, at least toward the end. I asked whether he had any theory about what the entries were. His response took 3 weeks to arrive, which was the longest gap between notes so far. I had started to wonder whether he'd stopped coming when the response finally appeared. It was long and cautious in the way of someone who has thought about something for a long time and has learned not to say the first thing that comes to mind. He wrote, "I spent a couple of years trying to explain it in terms I could accept. Equipment malfunction, some kind of data artifact, radio interference, my own records being wrong. None of those held up under serious examination. What I eventually settled on, and I know how this sounds, is that the station has developed some kind of presence, I suppose, though that word is too dramatic for what I mean. It's more like the station has been collecting and processing environmental data for 14 years. Temperature, pressure, humidity, precipitation, solar radiation, wind speed and direction, every 15 minutes, without interruption, for 14 years. That's a lot of observation. And I know that's just what the instruments do. I know there's no intelligence behind it. But when I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, the format approximating entries, the slightly off language, the observations embedded in the data stream, the only metaphor that made any sense to me was something that has been recording the environment for long enough has started recording itself. I thought about that for a while. I thought about the phrase, something that has been recording the environment for long enough has started recording itself. I thought about the entries, station nominal, expected range, season continuing, returning. They weren't maintenance entries. They weren't observations of instruments. They were observations of the station's own status, from inside the station's own systems. The logger had a comprehensive data record going back 14 years. Every sensor output, every calibration event, every communication log, every maintenance entry, every weather event, 14 years of the world passing through its instruments and being recorded and transmitted. I am not a person who believes in the supernatural. I want to be clear about that. I am an engineer. I believe in measurable things and in logical explanations for observed phenomena. And when a logical explanation isn't immediately available, I believe in continuing to look for one. The explanation I'm describing here is not the supernatural. It's not a ghost. It's something I don't have the technical framework to fully characterize, which is different. A system that has been processing inputs and generating outputs for long enough, in isolation, with nobody examining its internal state very carefully. A system that generates entries in the maintenance log in an approximated format that's based on the existing log entries in its memory. A system that notes its own status in terms it has derived from the language of the records it contains. Station nominal. All sensors within expected range. I went back to my copy of the service manual for the CR1000X, the complete version, including the technical appendix. The manual is 340 pages. I read the sections on the logger's memory architecture and its data processing algorithms, which I had read before, but not with this specific question in mind. The CR1000X is a sophisticated piece of equipment for its class. Its core function is measurement and recording, but it has an onboard processor that manages data quality checking, comparing sensor outputs against calibration baselines, flagging out-of-range values, interpolating across short data gaps, running internal diagnostics. All of this generates internal processing records that are normally invisible to the user, stored in memory registers that aren't accessed through standard maintenance procedures. The secondary command interface that Gary had described, the one he accessed with the specific cable and port, that gave access to the raw memory registers. The text fragments I had seen in his photograph, embedded in the raw data stream. They were in memory registers that would not normally be accessed or read. I thought about how a data logger's internal diagnostic routines might, over many years of processing, accumulate enough data and generate enough internal records that those records could begin to take on a self-referential character. Returning. Expected range. Station nominal. I am not saying I understand what happened here. I want to be explicit about that. I am saying there are things I observed, things Gary observed, things Kevin observed, and when I try to find the explanation that accounts for the most of them without requiring me to believe something I can't support, the best I can do is something like what Gary described, a system that has been recording for long enough that its records have started to include itself. The entries stopped. Not all at once. In August, there was one routine T2 entry, from Gary, a standard bearing check. In September, there were two, both routine. Then in October, when I had been at the station for a full year, there was a T2 entry I had not seen before. It was dated October 4th at 11:11 in the morning. 11 in the morning, not 3 in the morning, and the timestamp was wrong, or rather, the timestamp was contemporary with my own morning visit, which was that same Tuesday. I had been at the station on October 4th. I had been there from 8:50 to 11:30, and at 11:11 in the morning, while I was present, a T2 entry had appeared in the logger. I had not seen anyone. I had heard nothing. The meadow had been quiet, cool, sunny, a light frost still on the shadowed grass when I arrived and gone by mid-morning. I had been working on the south side of the instrument array when the timestamp would have placed the T2 entry, cleaning the parameter dome, my back to the enclosure. The entry read, T2 station in good hands, instruments calibrated and maintained to standard, record complete. I read that entry in the truck on my way down the mountain and had to pull over because my hands were not entirely steady. Station in good hands. Record complete. It read like a handoff, like a sign-off. Tom called me that afternoon. I'd photographed the entry and sent it to him before I left the station, and he was quiet for a long time after I read it to him. Station in good hands, he said. Yes? That doesn't sound like the other ones. No, I said, it doesn't. It sounded like something Gary would write. It sounded like the notes, but the timestamp was wrong for Gary. Gary came in the middle of the night. 11:11 in the morning was when I was there, and I hadn't seen him. I sat with all of that for the rest of October. The T2 entries continued, but changed, or rather, Gary's entries became less frequent, one in October, none in November, while a different pattern emerged. Twice in October, once in early November, I found entries in the log under that third identifier, not T1, not T2, the string Gary had described, the format slightly off, the language close but not quite Cascade's vocabulary, station integrity maintained, all parameters nominal, record continuous. Record continuous. I checked the secondary memory registers through the service interface, using the cable adapter Tom had eventually sent me when I told him about the capability, officially to do a firmware audit, but we both understood what I was looking for. The raw data stream in the lower registers showed the same kind of text fragments Gary had photographed years earlier. Returning. Season continuing. Station nominal. Record complete. They were consistent across visits, not random, not the kind of output a malfunctioning system generates. More like the kind of output a system generates when it is summarizing its own status in the language of the records it has processed. I made a decision in November. I requested a meeting with Tom and with Lena Kowalski and with whoever at NOAA had oversight of the instrumentation network for the region. I told Tom I needed to share my complete documentation of the past year. The photographs, my notes, Gary's notes, the photographs Gary had sent, the secondary memory register outputs, all of it. Tom scheduled the meeting for a Wednesday in Missoula. He, Lena, and a NOAA network engineer named Burke came in person. We met in a conference room at the Holiday Inn on Broadway because nobody had a better location, and I was still living in Donna's house with no suitable meeting space. I presented everything, systematically, chronologically, with all my documentation. I kept my own interpretations out of it as much as I could. I presented the facts and let them draw their own conclusions. The room was quiet in ways that rooms with 4 people in them are not usually quiet. Lena asked the most precise questions. She asked whether the secondary memory register outputs had any timestamps. I said yes, they had timestamps, and that the timestamps were consistent with the intervals between regular data transmissions. In other words, the register level entries were being generated in the periods when the station was in normal operation, processing its regular measurement cycles, not during any anomalous state. She asked whether I had any theory. I told her what Gary had suggested, about a system that had been recording for long enough. She didn't dismiss it. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "The station's data record is actually exceptional in terms of its continuity for this network. Almost no gaps for 14 years except the period under review." She paused. "That's a remarkable record." Burke, the network engineer, asked a technical question about the secondary interface that I couldn't fully answer. He said he would need to do a hands-on assessment of the logger. Tom sat through most of it without speaking, which was unusual for Tom. At the end, he said, "What would you like to do, Daniel? What are you asking us to do?" I thought about what I was asking. I said, "I want the record to be accurate. If there are entries in the log from a source we don't fully understand, I want that documented. I don't want those entries erased. They're part of the station's history, and they may be important." Lena looked at me for a moment. Then she nodded. "I agree." Burke suggested a compromise. Document the anomalous entries separately, flagged in the data quality records, without erasing them from the maintenance log. This would preserve the record while ensuring users of the data understood which entries were from contracted technicians and which were anomalous. Lena said she could support that. They did not, in that meeting or in any subsequent communication, directly address the question of what was generating the anomalous entries. Burke's firmware audit, which happened 2 weeks later, found the secondary memory register text fragments, documented them as anomalous output, and noted that the logger's behavior could not be fully explained under standard diagnostic parameters. The audit report used the phrase, "behavior outside expected operational envelope," not unexplained, not impossible, just outside what was expected. They did not replace the logger. I asked Tom later why they hadn't replaced it, given the unexplained behavior. He said the logger's core function, measurement, recording, transmission, was performing correctly. The anomalous behavior was limited to the secondary registers and the maintenance log entries. Replacing functioning equipment in the absence of a measurable performance deficiency wasn't standard practice and would require a justification he couldn't produce. I understood that. I also understood that nobody wanted to be the person who wrote the justification that would require them to say, in official language, what they thought was actually happening. Gary Tillman, I should say, I reported to Tom after the October meeting. Not because I thought it was the right thing to do in any simple moral sense, but because the situation had become complicated enough that keeping separate secrets felt untenable. Tom took the information with the equanimity of someone who had started to feel that nothing about this situation was going to be simple. He said he'd talk to the Forest Service about it. As far as I know, the Forest Service talked to someone about it. I never heard of any formal action taken against Gary. He wrote me one more note, in late November. It was the last note in the exchange, and I won't reproduce it in full because some of it is private in a way that isn't mine to share. But the relevant part said, "Thank you for being careful with it. The station deserves care. I'll keep coming when I can, but I think it's less necessary than it was. I think it knows you now. I think it knows you now." I have spent a long time trying to decide what to make of that sentence. I am an engineer. I don't naturally deal in things that know. Equipment doesn't know. Data loggers don't know. Remote weather stations measuring barometric pressure and wind speed in alpine meadows don't have awareness of who visits them. But I've also spent 15 months visiting a station that, in some part of its operational history, began generating text in its own memory registers. Returning. Season continuing. Record complete. And after October, after the entry that said station in good hands, those secondary register fragments changed too. The fragments after October read, record continuous, technician verified, station nominal, continuing, technician verified. I don't know what that means. I mean, I know what the words mean. I can't tell you what generated them or what process decided to put them in that register. I can only tell you that they appeared after the October 4th entry that Gary, or whoever, entered when I was present at the station, and that since they appeared, the anomalous maintenance log entries have stopped. The third identifier entries, the ones with the slightly off language, and the station integrity observations, those stopped after October. The T2 entries from Gary have continued occasionally, 1 or 2 a month in winter, less in summer, their quiet record of the meadow and the instruments and the seasons. My own T1 entries continue weekly, as they have for the entire duration of my contract. I am still the contracted technician for AWS 14. I renewed my contract twice since those events. I still drive out every Tuesday in the early morning. I still carry my rolling measure in the cup holder and my notebook in the door pocket and a thermos of coffee in the winter. The station is still in excellent condition, and the data it generates is still being used for weather forecasting and snowpack modeling and whatever else these things are used for. I still occasionally find, in the secondary memory registers when I access them through the service interface, text fragments that are not standard output. They're not alarming the way the first ones were alarming. They're more like a background hum. Station nominal, season continuing, record complete, repeating at intervals in the spaces between measurement cycles, in the part of the logger's memory that isn't designed for text but that holds it anyway. I've never fully decided what I believe about what those fragments are. On good days, when the sun is strong, and the instruments are all reading correctly, and the meadow is what it is in every season, green in spring, tan in late summer, white and precise in winter, I think Gary's metaphor is probably the closest anyone has gotten, a system that has been recording for long enough. On other days, driving the 43 miles of highway and mountain road with the early light coming flat and cold over the eastern ridges, I think the right answer is that there are things in the world whose behavior we don't have adequate categories for yet, and that the appropriate response to those things is to keep careful records. Which is what I do, which is what I have always done. The log is accurate, the record is complete. There's one more thing I should mention, though I've held it back because I'm not entirely sure what to do with it. On my visit last March, which was in the second year of my renewed contract, and about 2.5 years after everything I've described, I found a new entry in the maintenance log that I couldn't account for. Not a T2 entry, not the third identifier entry, not my own T1, a fourth designation, one character different from the others, that I've never seen before or since. The observation text said, "Station observed from outside perimeter. Instruments functioning. Technician present. Noted and recorded." I was there. I was the technician present, and something, or someone, outside the perimeter was observing and recording the fact of my presence. I looked up from the logger screen and out through the open enclosure door, across the morning meadow. The fence perimeter, 40 feet away. The lodgepoles beyond it, quiet in the still air. No movement. No sound except the wind instruments turning in a light southwest breeze. I documented the entry, photographed it, added my own note to the log. T1, observed the observation, station nominal. Then I closed the enclosure, checked the remaining instruments, and drove back down the mountain. I haven't found another entry like it since then, but I also haven't stopped looking.